So, as I was going through Twitter yesterday, I've noticed that mainstream media is once again back on the rigging operation. There was a graphic released by CNN that showed presidential candidates that have dropped out and those who are still in the race. And of course, the one that showed those still in the race took the time to include someone like Julian Castro, who hasn't made, I think maybe the last two debate stages, but definitely wasn't on the last one. But I don't think he was in the last two, honestly. And it also included, or did not include, rather, Tulsi Gabbard, as to be expected. Now, it had Andrew Yang, but no Tulsi Gabbard. Okay. So, again, it looks like MSNBC and CNN are definitely, pulling overtime here to try and make people forget about Tulsi. They're literally trying to almost erase her from this event. The DNC decides all of a sudden they're not going to recognize a Suffolk poll that they've recognized in the past. Okay. And Suffolk, it's been clear that Suffolk was one of the polls they were going to recognize, but now we're not going to recognize that one. Okay, and that's what's my understanding is keeping Tulsi from the next round of debates. Now, MSNBC's been excluding her off of graphs, putting other candidates on. I've shown that multiple times. CNN's now doing the same thing. Other channels have covered this and different graphs as well. It's starting to become very clear. They're trying to almost erase her as if she's not even a part of this race and never was. Okay. With that being said, a lot of people have made comment when they've watched my videos stuff in the past about my knowledge of history. Well, that's going to be the focus of today's video. History. We're going to be talking about something that took place in the past that has rather big significance to what we're seeing in the mainstream media today. And of course, that event in history was the infamous Operation Mockingbird. Okay? Now, Operation Mockingbird was basically a plot from the CIA, started back in the 1950s or so, okay, to manipulate the news, the media, get journalists together and push propaganda, type of narratives out there, okay? Now, some of you may have heard of this. Some of you may have absolutely not one clue in the world as to what I am talking about. And that is the exact point of this video. We're going to examine something that took place over half a century ago, and we're going to talk about just what was involved in that process, and then we're going to compare that as to what we're seeing today. Because keep in mind, Operation Mockingbird was supposedly stopped some years ago. So we'll look at what they did, we'll look at what's going on today, and then we'll discuss whether or not we believe that this thing is really over with. Okay, so reading from an article here. Operation Mockingbird was allegedly, and I love how they say allegedly, it's definitely more than alleged. It's been proven that this happened. If anyone doubts that, welcome to do your own homework, and you'll find exactly what I find in researching this over the years. This definitely took place, okay? A large-scale program of the United States Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, that beginning in the early 1950s attempted to manipulate news media for propaganda purposes. It funded student and cultural organizations and magazines as front organizations. According to writer Deborah Davis, Mockingbird recruited leading American journalists into a propaganda network and oversaw the operations of front groups. CIA support of front groups was exposed after a 1967 Ramparts magazine article reported that the National Student Association received funding from the CIA. In the 1970s, congressional investigations and reports also revealed the agency's connections with journalists and civic groups. None of these reports, however, mentions an Operation Mockingbird controlling or supporting these activities. A Project Mockingbird is mentioned in the CIA Family Jewels report compiled in the mid-70s. According to a declassified version of the report released in 2007, Project Mockingbird involved wiretapping of 2 American journalists for several months in the early 1950s. Now, of course, that's just what you're seeing from the declassified version. So here's a longer description of the history of it, and we're going to read through this. The claim that the CIA ran an Operation Mockingbird first appeared in Catherine the Great, a 1979 biography of Washington Post owner Katharine Graham, written by reporter Deborah Davis. According to Davis, Operation Mockingbird was established by Frank Wisner, director of the Office of Policy Coordination, a covert operations unit created by the U.S. National Security Council. Davis writes that Mockingbird was a response to the creation of a Communist Front organization, the Internal Organization of Journalists, which received money from Moscow and controlled reporters on every major newspaper in Europe, disseminating stories that promoted the communist cause. Wisner recruited Philip Graham from the Washington Post to run the project within the industry. According to Davis, by the early 1950s, Wisner owned respected members of the New York Times, Newsweek, CBS, and other communications vehicles. In 1951, Allen W. Dulles persuaded Cord Meyer to join the CIA. According to Deborah Davis, Meyer became Mockingbird's principal operative. After 1953, the media network was overseen by CIA Director Allen Dulles, by which time Operation Mockingbird had major influence over 25 newspapers and wire agencies. The usual method was placing reports developed from the intelligence provided by the CIA to cooperating or unwitting reporters. Those reports would be repeated or cited by the preceding reporters, which in turn would then be cited throughout the media wire services. These networks were run by people with well-known liberal but pro-American big business and anti-Soviet views, such as William S. Paley from CBS, Henry Luce, Time and Life magazine, Arthur Hayes, Sulzberger from the New York Times, Alfred Friendly, managing editor of the Washington Post, Jerry O'Leary, Washington Star, Hal Hendricks, Miami News, Barry Bingham Sr., Louisville Courier-Journal, James Copley News Services, and Josh Harrison, Christian Science Monitor. Congressional investigations. After the Watergate scandal in 1972 through 1974, the U.S. Congress became concerned over possible presidential abuse of the CIA. The concern reached its height when reporter Seymour Hersh published an expose of the CIA domestic surveillance in 1975. Congress authorized a series of congressional investigations into agency activities from 1975 to 1976. A wide range of CIA operations were examined in these investigations, including CIA ties with journalists and numerous private voluntary organizations. None of the resulting reports, however, refer to an Operation Mockingbird. The most extensive discussion of CIA relations with the news media from these investigations in the Church Committee's final report, published in April 1976. The report covered CIA ties with both foreign and domestic news media. For foreign news media, the report concluded the CIA currently maintains a network of several hundred foreign individuals around the world who provide intelligence for the CIA and at times attempt to influence opinion through the use of covert propaganda. These individuals provide the CIA with direct access to a large number of newspapers and periodicals, scores of press services and news agencies, radio and television stations, commercial book publishers, and other foreign media outlets. For domestic media, the report states that approximately 50 of the agency's assets are individual American journalists or employees of U.S. media organizations. Of these, fewer than half are accredited by U.S. media organizations. The remaining individuals are non-accredited freelance contributors and media representatives abroad. More than a dozen United States news organizations and commercial publishing houses formerly provided cover for CIA agents abroad. A few of these organizations were unaware that they provided this cover. And what was the CIA's response to all this? Prior to the release of the Church Report, the CIA had already begun restricting its use of journalists. According to the report, former CIA Director William Colby informed the committee that in 1973 he had issued instructions as a general policy. The agency will not make any clandestine use of staff, employees, or of U.S. publications which have a substantial impact or influence on public opinion. In February 1976, Director George H.W. Bush announced an even more restrictive policy. Effective immediately, the CIA will not enter into any paid or contractual relationship with any full-time or part-time news correspondent accredited by the U.S. News Service, paper, periodical, radio, or television network or station. By the time the Church Committee report was completed, all CIA contacts with accredited journalists had been dropped. The committee noted, however, that accredited correspondent meant ban was limited to individuals formerly authorized by contract or insurance of press credentials to represent themselves as correspondents, and that non-contract workers who did not receive press credentials, such as stringers or freelancers, were not included. Okay? Now, we're going to read through a little bit more here, and then we're going to finally get to this discussion. In 2007, it talks about the Family Jewels report compiled by the CIA in 1973. Talks about where it references it. All right. Project Mockingbird, a telephone intercept activity, was conducted between March 12, 1963 and June 15, 1963, and targeted two Washington-based newsmen who at the time had been publishing news articles based on and frequently quoting classified materials of the agencies and others, including top secret and special intelligence. The wiretap was authorized by CIA Director John McCone in coordination with Attorney General Mr. Robert Kennedy, the Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and the Director of Defense Intelligence Agency General Joseph Carroll. An internal CIA biography of McCone by the CIA Chief Historian David Robarge, made public under FOIA request, or Freedom of Information Act, identified the two reporters as Robert Allen and Paul Scott. Their syndicated column, the Allen Scott Report, appeared in many as 300 papers at the height of its popularity. Okay, so now, while this pretty much just gave a general idea of what went on during all of this, okay, the problem here is they claim they shut this down. We went through all that, but what you just heard is that the CIA was trying to manipulate the news in this country through different methods. Get different reporters and journalists on board with their agenda to push their narratives. Now, what people are going to tell you about that is this, okay? Well, that shut down years ago. You just read right there in that article, they started canceling this stuff down after Watergate. Now, what have we learned about the federal government, okay? Anytime they get caught red-handed doing something that doesn't go over well, as some say here in the South, it goes over like a turd in a punch bowl, okay? When they get caught red-handed, they always seem to stop what they were doing. But of course, this is the federal government. This is the federal government that isn't exactly upfront with the American people. This is the federal government that will, without hesitation, lie to the American people. So just because the reports claim that this has been stopped, are you really to believe that those reports were actually stopped? Because I have serious doubts that they were. And as a matter of fact, to me, it actually makes perfect sense when you look at what's going on in the mainstream media today, because it's very clear that they're not reporting the news, they're pushing propaganda, okay? Now, whether, at this time around it's the CIA involved in it, or whether it's just government entities and government lobbyists who run their ads on these TV networks, okay, and try to control the news through that way. Whichever the case is, I think that the second is definitely going on. I think that the advertisers and the big money donors and the sponsors are definitely trying to buy the news media off to push the narratives they want them to push and then hide things they don't want to talk about. You never hear this talked about hardly on mainstream media, and you're starting to see, like I said earlier, less and less of Tulsi Gabbard in the mainstream media. So whether or not it's the CIA doing it this time around, it's very clear that apparently mainstream media in this country can be bought off to push nothing but propaganda talking points, because it already happened over 50 years ago. The CIA had their hands deep into the news media in this country. Now, of course, they're also going to tell you, well, what they were pushing was nothing but true news, because there were communist news organizations trying to spread around false truths. And that might very well be. But in today's world, now they're trying to claim that something like RT, and while RT may have its flaws, okay, I've found you honestly get more honest news about what's going on in this country today and what's going on around the world than you would get on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, ABC, all these different news networks, CNN, CBS. It seems to me I learn more information when I have watched something on RT America than I do on the other thing, because while, most of those other networks want to talk about, Trump's tax returns, Stormy Daniels, Karen McDougal, Russia. I watched RT America and learned about what's going on with the housing market. I watched RT America and learned, more in-depth analysis of the politics, the economics, what's actually going on in countries around the world. And they go more in depth and are far more, give you a much better explanation for the things that they do talk about than you get on these babbling news networks, okay? The only problem is, and this is where the mainstream media attacks something like RT, is they are, as far as I know, in part funded by the Russian government. And so they're going to go, the Russians. So they're using that talking point again to try and bash that down today. And of course, they then start using that talking point to bash down channels like this one probably, but many other channels definitely. They haven't referenced me yet. I'm sure in time, if I ever become noticeable enough, they would. But they then get to the point where bigger YouTubers who point out these dissenting facts from the consensus of the mainstream media, who don't go along with the propaganda and don't go along with the talking point and support someone like Tulsi Gabbard. Well, she's a Russian asset and she's an Assad apologist. So all you YouTubers and internet bloggers and everyone else out there who support her and are pushing her narrative, you're all just a bunch of Russian bots and trying to push propaganda from your end. When that's not the case, we're exposing more truth than the mainstream media has in a long time. And so again, I say, this program was supposedly stopped. It was supposedly canceled. But when you examine what's going on in the mainstream media right now, even if it isn't exactly another Operation Mockingbird continuation or an Operation Mockingbird 2.0, there seems to be something very similar going on. There seems to be an agenda. And whether it's being done by the CIA, whether it's being done by the military-industrial complex, whether it's just simply being done by the rich and powerful who want to keep their status quo when they look at someone as Tulsi Gabbard like too much of a threat, Bernie Sanders, a little bit too much of a threat, Andrew Yang, we don't like his policies either. So, but it seems to be that the big recipient of the most, BS lately has definitely been Tulsi Gabbard. All three have been the recipient in their own way, but Tulsi Gabbard has by far been the biggest recipient here lately. Okay? And so whatever this is this time around, clearly there's something going on. And when you read back in history and you see that things like this definitely happened throughout times in the past, it really makes you raise the question and ask yourself, did it really stop actually after all? And if it did they just start something else up later on, and we now have the same thing? So let that sink in, that in the country that wants to bash government-funded news, basically, like RT, even though they're doing more honest reporting, this own government and intelligence agencies try to pay off and control the news through different ways in the past, okay? And it seems like, definitely seems like, they could very well be behind the scenes doing it again. And that is something that should be making every American terrified, because when you see things like that going on, they talk about Trump being a big threat to democracy. No. Stuff like that is the big threat to democracy in this country. Stuff like that is the threat to this republic, because that is what is turning us more and more and more every day on the path to being a true blue oligarchy and not a democratic republic. We won't be a republic anymore. If they keep these tactics up, we will be a complete oligarchy with nothing but government-ran news. And that's going to be a very bad day in the history of this country if we ever let it get to that point. That's why we have to keep this fight up. That's why I'm going to keep churning out these videos and trying to reach as many people as I possibly can. Because the duty of a true American patriot who cares about his country is to speak up and raise these concerns and try and reach as many people as he possibly can to raise the concern in their mind as well for the safety and protection of the freedoms in this country. Remember, it was Thomas Jefferson who said, dissension is the greatest form of patriotism.